Okay, we're now at the fifth lesson where we're looking at how the USA increased the rivalry in the Cold War, within the context, of course, of who was to blame for the Cold War. Now, what we have to start off with first is the concept of the Truman Doctrine. In 1947, Harry Truman starts to get frustrated with the USSR. The USSR is clearly expanded into Eastern Europe. They show no intention of keeping the promises that they made at the Potsdam Conference, and he becomes concerned that the Soviets are going to soon come to dominate all of Europe, if not the world. And Truman comes up with a policy that he calls containment, and that's an incredibly important word. Containment. To contain something means to keep it in check. Okay, you contain liquid within a bottle. Okay, and what he's trying to do with his policy of containment is to keep the USSR, the Soviet Union, from expanding. And he has three reasons that he wants to do this. Okay. Firstly, the United States, especially Truman, believed that the Soviet Union was trying to spread communism. He thought first, of course, that it was going to do it through getting all of Eastern Europe and not allowing those countries fair and free elections as promised in the conferences. And then he was thinking that from once it had established a foothold in Eastern Europe, it would expand to the West and perhaps beyond into Asia. So he comes up with the idea that the United States needs to contain or act to prevent the spread of communism. The second reason he's willing to take such a bold move, and it's quite provocative, the Truman Doctrine, the fact that we will say, we will stop you and we will use our military if necessary, is the fact that the United States has the atomic bomb, and the Soviets will not match the atomic bomb until 1948. And with this window of opportunity and having the A bomb, they know they could use their military strength, as long as with their superior economic strength, to ensure that the United States hems Russia in. And Russia isn't really capable of winning a war if it were to come to that. And the third reason has to be events in Greece, and I'll explain those in a minute. Altogether, this policy of containment is known as the Truman Doctrine. A doctrine is a belief set out by a politician. Okay, you will run into many doctrines as we go through this Cold War course. You'll learn about the Truman Doctrine, the policy of containment. There will be the Brezhnev Doctrine, the Carter Doctrine, just to name a few. And all, of course, named after the leaders of both the Soviet Union and the United States. And so this is the Truman Doctrine, preventing the Soviets from spreading, using containment to spread communism. Now, what happened in Greece that makes it so important? Well, at Greece, was a country that at the Yalta Conference was agreed that it would be a British sort of sphere of influence, and they would influence what happened in Greece. And since 1944, Britain had been supporting Greece and the government there, the monarchy of Greece, who were fighting a communist insurgency. There were many Greeks who wanted to become a communist country, and they were trying to get rid of the royal family, which was actually, interestingly enough, closely entwined to the British royal family. The Queen's current husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, is the son of the King and Queen of Greece. And I'm not sure if you knew that or not, Philip Mountbatten. And they were, of course, very much intertwined with the British royal family and part English anyhow. But neither here nor there, Britain and Greece's ties are quite strong. But in 1946, the communists are heavily defeated by the royalists in an election. And the communists really refuse to get up. They give up. They, instead of fighting this battle to take control of Greece politically, they sort of devolves into a civil war, and they start to fight a guerrilla war against the government. They're aided by neighboring communist countries such as Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and even the Soviet Union. And the communist guerrillas in Greece are really legitimately looking like they're going to overthrow the royalist government. And the British pour aid into Greece. The problem is the 40,000 troops that Britain had in Greece were incredibly expensive. Britain in 1947 is suffering in a multitude of ways. Firstly, massive debt. The Second World War was incredibly expensive to fight, and as a result, Britain has spent all of its money and owes huge sums of money, predominantly to America, for the costs of fighting this war. And they can no longer afford to support the Greeks. As a result, in 1947, the British government says to it, when it has other issues, that is India, it's trying to keep within the empire at this time. It's unable to do so. It leaves in 1948. But in 1947, it says, listen, we have bigger fish to fry. We can't afford this. We want to help Greece, but we can't. You need to help us help Greece. And in many ways, the Truman Doctrine evolves because America ends up stepping into the Greek situation to prevent the Greek country, or the country of Greece, from falling to the communists. And in essence, they begin the policy of containment before Truman ever formalizes the policy. And the United States steps in with financial aid to prevent a Soviet communist takeover of Greece, and they are successful. Once they are successful, Truman effectively says, okay, if we're doing it, we may as well give it a name. And because we're successful in doing so, we will announce in what I will call the policy of containment in the frame of the Truman Doctrine. And this is really a turning point in U.S. foreign policy. Between Potsdam in 1947, the U.S. had played little part in European affairs and had sort of retreated and let Europe sort itself out. After 1947, the United States will become intricately intertwined in the affairs of Western Europe. Truman is committing the United States to this policy of containment, and that's going to involve the United States in European affairs, both militarily and in terms, probably more than anything, in terms of lending and giving huge sums of money to countries to prevent them from falling into communist hands, as evidenced really by the cartoon on the right. So the Truman Doctrine, a couple important things. Doctrine is a belief. Congress is the American Parliament. An aggressor is someone who starts a quarrel, and containment is holding something in, stopping the USSR from growing. So the Truman Doctrine said that the United States was duty bound. To be duty bound means it must do it. To prevent the spread of communism to Eastern Europe and the rest of the world. To do this, Truman was prepared to engage the United States in military activity all over the world so as to prevent the spread of communism to any other country. And most of the conflicts that originate, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, et cetera, are really extensions of the Truman Doctrine, where the United States is putting its troops where its mouth is, saying that we will put our men in the field to stop the spread of communism. The consequences of the Truman Doctrine are many and varied. Obviously, in short term, of course, the Greek royalist government defeats the communists, and Greece remains a democratic country, very much allied to the United States and Great Britain. However, it increases tension dramatically. Stalin sees the Truman Doctrine as a great affront, really the confirmation that Truman is now the bad guy. Truman goes on to say that the world was divided between the free, the non-communists, and the unfree, the communists. The USA commits itself to the policy of containment and more involvement in Europe, and as a consequence of this, they will decide on something known as the Marshall Plan. And this is incredibly important. The Marshall Plan will become the United States' way of controlling Europe, lending huge sums of money to the governments of Britain, France, Greece, West Germany, to name a few. And in return, those countries effectively promise to remain allied to the United States against the Soviet Union. Stalin will set up an organization on the other side known as Common Form, where he gives money and organizes the economies of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc., with the same intention. But we're really going to talk about the Marshall Plan right now. The Marshall Plan is sometimes known as the Economic Aid to Europe Plan, and Truman basically backs up his policy of containment with billions of American dollars. He believed, Truman did, that countries that were poor could become communists. People who were poor, people who were starving, are more likely to believe in communist ideology than that of capitalism. The idea that sort of the rich can have their riches taken over and everything will be distributed equally. You may not be exceptionally rich, but you'll be better off than poor. And that, he believed, was appealing to people who were poor. So he decides that the United States is going to take much of its newfound riches and give huge sums of money to Europe. The idea is that Europe would pay it back. In reality, not much is actually paid back. The cover-up for this is that it will help the countries of Europe rebuild. It's 1947. We're less than 2 years after the end of the Second World War, and these countries had been bombed and destroyed by the terrible, terrible fighting, and they were struggling to rebuild because most of them were broke. So rationing, for instance, Britain still rationing essential goods up until the 1950s. By giving money to prevent this from happening, giving money to help these countries rebuild, giving money to feed their people, it was believed that these countries would then ally themselves to the United States, and it was true. So if the USA could help these countries achieve sort of reasonable prosperity, there'd be no need to turn to communism. It's named after George Marshall, who was the United States Secretary of State, basically the leading diplomat of the United States. And George Marshall gets the Marshall Plan named after him because, in fact, it is his idea, and he is the one who administers this money. The plan is called the European Recovery Act, but is, of course, nicknamed and most commonly known as the Marshall Plan. Aid came in the form of cash. The NHS is founded on the Marshall Plan. Machinery, food, and technological assistance, i.e., assistance helping you set up new factories, new military technology. In return, though, all of that money would then have to be spent on buying US goods, which of course gives the double benefit of allowing US companies to invest in their industries and to become very, very, very profitable. So the Marshall Plan, in a sense, is giving money to Europe on the contingency that they spend it on American stuff to help Europe again. So everybody sort of wins. The Marshall Plan proves to be a tremendous success because countries that receive Marshall aid countries that receive Marshall aid do very well in their rebuilds. France rebuilds very quickly, Belgium does, Britain does, etc., etc. However, Stalin despises the Marshall Plan. He sees it for what he thinks it is, a way to block communist takeovers, and he tries to block, and Stalin actually prevents all of his countries that he's sort of controlled since the end of the Second World War from receiving Marshall Plan. By 1953, the United States had given $17 billion to rebuild the economies and raise the standard of living in Europe. Europe becomes, as a result of the Marshall Plan, more firmly divided between East and West. There's the countries that get the Marshall aid and those that don't. The countries that get the Marshall aid must be democratic. They must be capitalist. Those that don't are the communist countries, which Stalin prevents in the East. Stalin, as a result, will withdraw the USSR from discussions. He doesn't trust the USA and basically breaks down any sort of communication between the United States and the Soviet Union. He realizes that his economic situation is much weaker. Not only was the Soviet Union more destroyed, the communist economy doesn't produce to the level of the United States one. So what he does to prevent the Eastern European countries from getting Marshall aid is he just effectively shuts them down. He institutes more control. He forbids any Eastern European states from applying for it. He believed basically that anti-communist aims behind it, and it truly was a maneuver that was anti-communism. Underneath the Marshall Plan, it might seem generous, but in reality, it is very politically motivated. You will get this if you don't become communists. And he believed that if countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary that wanted Marshall aid got Marshall aid, it would weaken his hold over those countries, and it was likely that they wouldn't become communist. He also felt that the United States was trying to dominate as many states as possible, and in fact, he was right about that. But that doesn't necessarily mean he was any less angry about it. Okay, there was very much a naked understanding of what it was. The USSR, fair enough to say, despises the Marshall Plan. Stalin will say, or rather Malenkov, his sort of right-hand man, will say, the ruling gang of American imperialists has taken the path of open expansion, of enslaving the weakened capitalist countries. It has hatched new plans against the Soviet Union. It imitates Hitler. They are the new aggressors. They're using blackmail to form an alliance against us. Anyhow, most people tend to believe this, and as you can see from the cartoon on the right, a very famous cartoon, pops up in exams all the time, titled The Marshall Plan in Practice. You have the Soviets holding horse reins, and basically those horse reins are reining in the countries into the American fold to try and attack, if you will, the Soviet Union. Now, just a couple quick things before it's over. There's a question, we'll come to that in a lesson, but just a couple quick things. The Marshall Plan is massively provocative. It's very successful because it keeps countries allied to the United States, but it increases tension massively. A lot of people believe that the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan really set off the Cold War. If you thought the Iron Curtain speech were bad, tensions incredibly increase up into this point, and Stalin begins to feel very threatened. He feels that Truman is very aggressive, and he's right. And he believes that these threats, if you will, have increased tension to a point when it's no longer in any way, shape, and form possible to work together. And this will have interesting consequences when we come to the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union share the city of Berlin. How the Soviets respond to the Marshall Plan and how they react to the very provocative nature of the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine is evidenced by their next move, the subject of our next lesson.